The mountain loomed over him like a silent judge, vast and unmoving, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. After days of struggle, suffering, and relentless endurance, he finally stood before its final challenge. This was no longer just another obstacle on the journey. It was the confrontation. The cold air cut deeper here, sharper, carrying with it the weight of every decision that had led him to this point. He could feel it in his chest, the understanding that there would be no easy path forward, no safe retreat. The mountain offered only one question now, and it demanded an answer through action, not thought. He paused longer than he had all week, staring at the towering wall of ice and stone ahead. The climb was steep, exposed, and merciless. One slip could erase everything. Every instinct warned him of the danger, reminding him how fragile his body had become after days of punishment. The mountain did not roar or threaten, it didn't need to. Its silence was enough. It stood indifferent, uncaring whether he lived or vanished into the frozen depths below. That indifference made the moment heavier, more personal. This was not a battle the mountain initiated, it was one he had chosen simply by coming this far. As he prepared to move, memories flooded his mind. Each storm survived, each night endured, each moment when giving up had seemed easier than continuing. All of it had led here. The mountain had tested him piece by piece, stripping away comfort, strength, and certainty until only the essentials remained. Now it demanded the final payment, absolute commitment. There was no room for hesitation. To climb was to risk everything. To turn back was to accept defeat and an uncertain fate in the cold behind him. The confrontation was as much internal as it was physical. Standing there, he understood that the mountain was not just a place, it was a mirror. It reflected every fear, every weakness, every doubt he carried inside. But it also reflected his resilience, his stubborn refusal to disappear, his capacity to endure when logic said he shouldn't. This final climb was the purest form of truth he had encountered, stripped of excuses, stripped of safety, stripped of hope beyond the next movement. With trembling hands, he reached for the ice, fully aware that this was the moment that would define everything. The mountain did not challenge him with words, but with reality. This was the final confrontation, not because it was the highest point, but because it demanded a decision that could not be undone. In facing the mountain one last time, he wasn't just fighting the cold, the height, or the danger. He was facing the ultimate question of survival itself, standing at the edge where courage, fear, and choice collided, and where only one thing mattered: whether he would keep going or become another silent part of the ice. His body had crossed a line where exhaustion no longer felt sharp or urgent. It had become a dull, constant weight that pressed on every movement. This was not the kind of fatigue that could be relieved by rest or warmth. It was total depletion. Muscles no longer responded with strength, but with memory, moving because they had learned the motion through repetition, not because energy remained. Each step forward was powered by habit and necessity, not vitality. Pain had settled deep into his bones, no longer screaming for attention, but reminding him, quietly and relentlessly, that there was nothing left to give. His hands shook as he gripped the ice, fingers stiff and numb, struggling to obey the simplest commands. The cold had drained sensation from his skin, making it difficult to judge pressure or grip. His legs trembled under his own weight, threatening to collapse with every shift in balance. Hunger had hollowed him out, stripping away reserves he no longer possessed. The body, starved and battered by days of exposure, was operating on emergency mode, conserving what little remained while slowly shutting down anything unnecessary for survival. Breathing itself felt laborious. The thin air burned his lungs, forcing each inhale to be shallow and controlled. His heart pounded harder than it should have for such slow movement, a clear signal that his system was struggling to keep up. Dizziness crept in at the edges of his vision, and concentration required effort he could barely afford. Simple decisions, where to place a foot, when to rest, how long to hold position, became exhausting calculations. The margin for error had vanished, because his body no longer had the strength to recover from mistakes. What frightened him most was how quiet his body had become. The sharp pain, the loud protests, the violent signals to stop had faded. In their place was numbness and weakness, a dangerous calm that tempted him to slow down, to pause too long, to rest where rest could turn into surrender. He recognized this state instinctively. It was the body's last defense, conserving energy by reducing sensation, even if that meant drifting closer to collapse. Yet somehow he continued, not because his body was capable, but because stopping was not an option. Movement, however slow, was the only thing keeping him alive. He relied on technique instead of strength, balance instead of power, precision instead of speed. Every action was measured, deliberate, and minimal. This was survival stripped down to its rawest form, where the body no longer supported ambition, only existence. He understood with sobering clarity that he was no longer climbing with his body, he was carrying it forward, step by fragile step, through a moment where endurance meant simply refusing to fall still. Inside his mind, a battle raged far more dangerous than the ice beneath his feet. One voice spoke softly, almost kindly, offering relief from the pain and exhaustion. It urged him to stop, to rest, to let go of the struggle that had consumed every ounce of his strength for days. It painted surrender as peace, as stillness, as an end to suffering. In the cold and silence of the mountain, that voice felt seductive, logical even. After everything he had endured, wasn't he allowed to stop? Wasn't it reasonable to accept that he had gone far enough? But another voice answered back, quieter, heavier, and far more stubborn. It did not promise comfort or safety. It spoke only of life, of breath, of movement, of the simple refusal to disappear. This voice reminded him of every step that had brought him here, every moment when giving up would have been easier, but survival had demanded more. It did not argue with fear, it stood beside it. It acknowledged the pain, the weakness, the overwhelming odds, and still insisted that he continue. The conflict tore at him with every movement. When his hands slipped slightly on the ice, surrender whispered again. When his legs shook uncontrollably, it returned, urging him to stop fighting what seemed inevitable. The cold amplified these thoughts, slowing his reactions, blurring the line between reason and temptation. In that fragile state, choosing to live was no longer automatic. It required conscious effort, repeated again and again with every step and every breath. Survival had become a series of decisions made moment by moment, not a single heroic act. He realized that the mountain was not forcing him to quit. The danger was internal. The real threat was the moment he might agree with the voice that told him to stop. This understanding sharpened his awareness. He began to treat each thought with caution, questioning it the same way he questioned unstable ice. If a thought encouraged stillness, he rejected it. If it urged movement, no matter how small, he followed it. The choice to survive became practical, stripped of emotion and drama. Live meant move. Die meant stop. In that brutal clarity, fear lost some of its power. He no longer thought about the summit, the descent, or what awaited beyond the mountain. His world narrowed to the present second. One grip, one step, one breath. Each time surrender whispered, survival answered with action. The struggle inside him did not end, but it no longer controlled him. By continuing to choose movement over rest, resistance over release, he proved something vital to himself. Survival was not about eliminating doubt or fear. It was about acting despite them. In the cold silence of the mountain, where no one could see or save him, the final battle was fought entirely within, and with every deliberate motion forward, he chose life again, not once, but hundreds of times, refusing to let surrender have the final word. Every movement he made on that final climb carried weight far beyond effort. It carried consequence. There was no room left for wasted motion, no energy to recover from mistakes. The mountain demanded total attention, forcing him into a state of absolute presence where past and future ceased to exist. He could not think about how far he had come or how far he still needed to go. His world narrowed to the immediate reality in front of him, the ice beneath his hands, the edge of his boots biting into the frozen slope, and the fragile balance holding him between life and the abyss below. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, testing the ice before committing his weight. A grip taken too quickly could fail. A misplaced tool could shatter the surface and send him sliding. Even the act of breathing required control. Inhaling too sharply could trigger dizziness in the thin air, while exhaling too long could steal the rhythm he needed to stay steady. The mountain punished haste and rewarded patience, turning each second into a calculation where survival hinged on precision rather than strength. The wind howled around him, cutting through layers of clothing and chilling exposed skin, but he could not afford distraction. Fear pressed in constantly, especially when he looked down and saw the drop stretching endlessly beneath him. His legs trembled, not only from exhaustion, but from the knowledge that one wrong move would erase everything. Yet fear, if left unchecked, could paralyze him just as effectively as exhaustion. He learned to acknowledge it without letting it dictate his actions. Fear became information, not an order. It reminded him to move carefully, not to stop. Time began to distort. Seconds felt stretched, each action elongated by concentration. He no longer measured progress by distance, but by successful movements, one solid grip, one stable step, one controlled shift of weight. These moments, small and fragile, became victories. Every successful movement reinforced his focus, creating a fragile momentum that he clung to with everything he had left. In this state, survival was no longer abstract. It was built from individual actions executed correctly. One after another, without pause or hesitation, the mountain offered no forgiveness. It did not care how tired he was, how much pain he carried, or how badly he wanted to live. It responded only to action. Stillness was dangerous. Rushing was fatal. The only path forward lay in complete attention and deliberate movement. He understood that survival now depended not on courage or strength, but on discipline and presence. Each movement was a decision, and each decision carried life or death within it. As he continued upward, step by careful step, he accepted the truth of the moment. There would be no dramatic rescue, no sudden burst of energy. Survival would come from doing the next small thing correctly, again and again, until the climb was behind him. In that narrow space between ice and air, he learned that when every movement becomes life or death, survival is forged through focus, restraint, and the relentless commitment to stay present in the face of overwhelming risk. As he reached the point where the climb ended and the choice could no longer be delayed, the weight of everything he had endured settled heavily on his chest. His body screamed for rest, urging him to stop, to sink into the ice and let the cold quiet the pain. Exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision, and the world seemed distant, as if he were watching himself from somewhere far away. In that moment, surrender felt deceptively peaceful. There was no fight in it, no struggle, only silence and stillness. The mountain offered that ending without resistance, and for a terrifying instant it felt inviting. But beneath the exhaustion, something stirred that had nothing to do with muscle or strength. It was memory. Faces, voices, unfinished promises, and moments of laughter surfaced in his mind, unbidden yet powerful. These were not grand visions of success or glory, but simple reminders of connection, proof that his existence mattered beyond this frozen slope. The thought of becoming another silent shape buried in the ice clashed violently with the idea of being remembered as someone who vanished without trying one last time. That inner resistance was quiet, almost fragile, but it refused to disappear. The cold pressed deeper, seeping into his thoughts, whispering that rest was reasonable, that he had already endured enough. It argued that no one would blame him for stopping. Yet that voice was met by another, steadier one that spoke not in emotion, but in resolve. It reminded him that survival was not about comfort or fairness. It was about choosing effort when effort felt impossible. The decision was no longer about the mountain, it was about identity. Would he be someone who yielded when the end felt near, or someone who acted even when hope was thin and the odds were cruel? He forced his body to respond not with urgency, but with intention. A shift of weight, a tightening of his grip, a slow, deliberate breath drawn through clenched teeth. Each action was a declaration that he was still choosing to live. Pain flared in response, sharp and immediate, but it also brought clarity. Pain meant sensation, and sensation meant consciousness. As long as he could feel, he could act. And as long as he could act, surrender was not inevitable. The mountain remained indifferent, but something within him had changed. Survival was no longer driven by fear of death alone. It was fueled by defiance. Not loud or dramatic defiance, but a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. He understood that even if he failed, choosing to move forward mattered. The act of choosing life, again and again, reclaimed a sense of control the mountain had tried to strip away. With each step away from stillness, he rejected the false peace of surrender. The ice no longer represented an ending, but a challenge to be answered. He did not know if the path ahead would lead to safety, but he knew that stopping would lead nowhere. And so he continued, carrying pain, memory, and resolve together, choosing movement over silence, and life over becoming part of the frozen world that waited patiently for him to give up.